So at this point in the course, you already learned a lot about using React with TypeScript. You learned a lot about common problems, use cases, scenarios, and important TypeScript features. But there's one important part of the React ecosystem, you could say, that's missing. And that would be Redux. Because, of course, many React projects do use Redux for global application-wide state management, for example, instead of the context API. And therefore, in this section, we'll take a look at how we can use Redux with TypeScript. For that, we'll see how we can set it up and make it work with TypeScript. We'll see how we can handle and manage state with Redux and TypeScript in a React application, and we'll also take a look at how we can dispatch actions. Now, as always, for this section here, I prepared a starting project, also a code sandbox version, and this starting project, once you start that development server with npm run dev locally after running npm install, on Code Sandbox, you don't have to do anything. This starting project will give you this dummy online shop website here. Now, at the moment, this shop doesn't work. For example, if we take a look at this number, it doesn't update as I click these buttons. And opening the cart also doesn't show us any items. And that's exactly what we'll implement with help of Redux in this section here. So this starting project, of course, already comes with some components, but these are fairly basic components that in the end just have basic props, if they have any props at all. And the most complex part of this starting project is probably the management of this cart modal, which is opened by the header component whenever this cart button is clicked. That's done with help of state, and the cart component then simply displays a backdrop and a dialog element, and it does all that with React's create portal function, a feature that's built into React, or to be precise, that's provided by React DOM, which simply makes sure that this JSX code is not injected into the DOM where this cart component is being used. So, for example, next to the header, but instead in some other place on the page. In this case, into some element with an ID of modal, which we can find in the index.html file. It's this div here. The only thing that's interesting from a TypeScript perspective about that code here is that there is this exclamation mark here, because otherwise TypeScript would think that this could be null, because maybe we're not finding an element with that ID. But of course we know that such an element exists, and therefore we can add this exclamation mark here to convince TypeScript of its existence. Other than that, we have standard components with standard props, so nothing fancy there. You also find a dummy products.ts file in this project, which simply contains the dummy product data that leads to these products being displayed on the screen. And therefore, that's now our starting point, which we can use to add Redux to this project. So to add Redux, you should open up your terminal and then install Redux by running npm install and then add redux.js/toolkit. By the way, on Code Sandbox, you don't need to run that. Instead, attached, you find a slightly updated project, which is the same project as before, just with Redux already installed into it. So we're installing Redux Toolkit here because that's the recommended way of working with Redux. In addition, we'll also install the React Redux package because that's the package that will allow us to connect our React app to the Redux store. Because technically, Redux is a standalone thing, though its most common use case definitely is inside of React apps. Now with that, these dependencies are installed. Again, You find a code sandbox link attached as well, if you want to use that. And we can then start the development server again. And with that installed and everything up and running, we can now start setting up that Redux store, so that global state that should get managed. Now, if you've never worked with Redux before, I strongly recommend that you dive into the official docs first, or you take some course, like my React course or any other course that does teach you Redux. Because this course is not a Redux course. I do assume that you know what Redux is and how it generally works. In general, the main idea with Redux is that you set up a global data storage and you then dispatch actions to that storage from any component of your choice. A little bit as we did it with the useReducer hook earlier in the course. And those actions then trigger reducer functions not created by the useReducer hook, but instead managed by Redux, that will then update the state. So really similar to what we did earlier with the context API and useReducer, but now done with Redux. And we can then also select data from the store from inside our components. Therefore, as a first step, I'll add a store folder here in this SRC folder. Though that name is up to you, it's just a common choice, but not a must do. And in there, I'll add a store.ts file. And it's now in this store.ts file where the general Redux store should be set up. For that, you should import configure store from @redux.js/toolkit. And then you should call configure store. Now this will create such a Redux store, and to do that, it wants an object. An object that in the end tells Redux how that store should be set up. And the information it needs here is essentially a reducer. Because with Redux, you don't really create that store by telling it what its initial state should be. Instead, you tell it what its reducer is, and Redux will then infer the type of data that it will manage from that reducer. So from the data that's returned by that reducer. So therefore, we have to add such a reducer key. As a next step, in order to be able to assign a value here, I'll add a second file in that store folder, which I'll name cart-slice.ts. Because when working with Redux and Redux Toolkit specifically, you work with so-called slices. You can simply think of your overall store as the combination of multiple state slices that are grouped together. In this demo app, we'll only have one slice, this cart slice, but in more complex, bigger apps, you could have multiple slices that work together. Now, inside of this cart slice TS file, you can and should then import the createSlice function from Redux.js Toolkit. And of course, then call that function to create such a slice. That slice should then also be stored, for example, in a constant called cart_slice, like this. And you should export this constant. Because it's now actually this cart_slice that should be used in the store.ts file. Here, you can now import this newly added and exported cart_slice from the cart_slice.ts file we just worked on. And then set this reducer equal to an object where you now have one key value pair per slice. So for example, one key called cart, which value is this cart_slice. To be precise, it's the reducer controlled by that cart_slice. And as you can see, this cart_slice thing automatically got a type, which gives us some auto-completion here in the IDE. So that's all handled by Redux Toolkit. And there is this reducer property, which you should access. With that, we can go back to the cart_slice.ts file, because of course this slice is not finished yet. Indeed, it doesn't contain any configuration or data at all at the moment. createSlice wants an object as an argument. And again, thanks to the excellent type support provided by Redux Toolkit, we also get nice autocompletion here. We can, for example, see that here we can set up an initial state. And that's what I meant. The overall store state is then inferred from all the state slices and their state values. So we can set up an initial state here. But before we do that, I want to give this slice a name of cart to uniquely identify it. But now we can set up this initial state. Just as we did it earlier in the course when we worked with the context API, it is a good idea to create a custom type here, which could be named cart state. That is an object type here, and it simply describes the shape of data this slice here should manage. Now here, for this simple app, I simply want to have an array of items here, an array of cart items. But of course, for that, I'll add another type here, which I'll name cart item, which describes an individual cart item. So that items here can then simply be an array of such cart items. And we can then use this cart state to create an initial state constant, for example, which should be of type cart state, like this. And then we could assign an initial value where items is an empty array. But any items that would be added to this array would have to be of type cart item, because that's how we configured this cart state here. Now every cart item then in this app should have an ID which is of type string, could be of type number, but in this app it's of type string. It should have a title, which is also of type string, a price which should be of type number, and also a quantity, which also should be of type number. Because of course, we can have 1 or 2 or 3 or any amount possible of items in our cart. So that's some type setup, and with that we got the initial state, which we store here in this initial state property. Though we can also use this JavaScript shortcut and assign it like this. And now there's just one last very important property missing, which is why we're getting this error here. And that's the reducers property. This property now sets up all the reducer functions for this slice. It wants an object as a value, and in this object you simply add any methods you need to manipulate that state later in this app. And you can give these methods any names you want. For example here, I'll add an add to cart method, and then also a remove from cart method. And now we can work on these reducers as a next step. So let's now work on these reducers. In the end, these reducer functions here should be triggered via dispatched actions. For example, when on a product we click this add to cart button. In that case, we want to wire everything up such that this add to cart method here gets executed. Now, the reducer methods you're adding here should typically accept two parameters, a state and an action. Which might sound familiar because that is what we also did with the reducer function of useReducer. That's not by accident because of course it's generally the same idea, that we have a function that receives an action and an old state and then produces a new state. Now, thankfully, since we're working inside of this reducers object, Redux Toolkit gives us great types here, and TypeScript therefore knows that state is of type writable draft, which is a generic type of cart state. So in the end, it's a mutatable version of the cart state. And action is of this type here, an object with a payload of type any and a type that's of type string. Now, whilst we do get those base types, we should be more specific regarding the action type and assign our own type explicitly here. Because there is a better type exposed by Redux Toolkit, which we should use here. And that's the payload action type, which should be imported from Redux Toolkit. This is the type of action we should assign here, and you should use this type whenever you're dealing with an action that carries a payload. So that does not just have a type, but also some extra data attached to it. If you have an action that does not have such extra data, you don't need this specific type. But this type then allows us to clarify which data will be attached to the action, which will then help us inside of the reducer function. For that, payload action is actually a generic type, a pretty complex looking generic type, but thankfully a type that's easy to use. You simply add your angle brackets here, and then between those brackets, you add the type definition of the type of data you expect to be attached to this action. And since you'll be the one who dispatches those actions, you get full control over how that data should look like. Here I'll say that this should be an object, so this data that's attached to the action will be of type object, where it will have an ID property, which is of type string, a title property, which will be of type string, and a price property, which will be of type number. That's how my payload should look like. And now I'm just getting some errors here because I'm not using action or state. But that's going to change now. So let's now use state and action in this add to cart function. Now the goal of this function here, of course, is to update the state such that this product that is described by this data is added to the cart. For that, I first of all want to find out if it's already part of the cart, because if it is, it's just the quantity that should be updated. If it's not, it should be added as a brand new item to the cart items array. For that, we can add a new constant called item index, for example, and use this state to take a look at the cart items in there and use the built-in findIndex method. This will give us the index of an item that's already in the cart, and if we can't find the item, we'll get -1 as a result instead. FindIndex then wants a function which is executed on every item in the cart, and this function should return true if we have the item we were looking for, or false otherwise. Therefore, in here, I want to return a check where I take a look at the item for which this function is currently executing. And if its ID is equal to the ID that's part of the dispatched action, so the ID of the product that should be added to the cart, I'll return true. So here we take a look at action, and then there, this data that's attached to the action will always be stored in a payload property, but that payload property will then have this type. So here we can then access ID. Now, as mentioned, item index will be -1 if the item was not found. So we can add a if check here and check if item index is greater or equal than 0, which means that an item with that ID was found in the cart. And in that case, we just want to update the quantity. And when using Redux Toolkit, we actually don't have to do that by returning a new state or anything like that. Instead, we are allowed to directly mutate the state. Something you should not do when using React's useReducer hook, but something you can do when using Redux Toolkit. So here, I'll then simply access my items, and there the item with that index I found, and I'll change its quantity by incrementing it, by increasing it by 1, with this shortcut notation here. Else, if we did not find the item, I'll also manipulate the items array, but now by pushing a new item onto it. And here, the item should generally be the product that we have in our payload. But our cart items also need a quantity property. And that was not part of the payload data. So therefore here, I'll also add a quantity property and set this to 1, since this is the first time that we're adding this item. Well, and that's the logic for adding items to the cart. Now we can also remove items from the cart. Now, to remove items from the cart, we again should start by accepting a state and an action. And this action will also be a payload action because it will carry some extra data, because we need some information about which item should be removed from the cart. Therefore, here it will actually be enough to get the ID of the item that should be removed, and the ID here in my app will be of type string. Therefore, this payload here will be of type string. And that's therefore the generic type argument I'm passing to this generic payload action type. Inside of remove from cart, we can then again find the item by index and then check if the item for that index, if its quantity is equal to 1. Because if it is, that means that we want to entirely remove the item from the cart, not just decrease its quantity, but instead get rid of it entirely. And we can do that by using the built-in splice method on this items array, which takes the index of the item that should be removed as a first argument, and then the number of items that should be removed starting at that index as the second argument. And here it is of course just one item, the item I found here at that index, and therefore I'll set this second argument to 1. By the way, here we have to change this expression here, because now the entire payload already is the ID. It's no longer an object with an ID property, and therefore instead it's the entire payload that should be compared to the item ID here. But with that, back to this if check here. If the quantity is not equal to 1, so if it's greater than 1, we don't want to remove the item from the array. Instead, then we just want to get this item at that index and reduce its quantity by 1 by using this shortcut operator. And that's now the logic for removing items from the cart. So now that we finished the work on these reducers, and we therefore finished the work on this slice in the end, we're pretty much done with setting up that store. At least it's now able to manage some data and potentially change that data. Therefore now we can store this store in a variable or constant, which I conveniently named store here, and which I'm exporting, because now the next step is to make that store available to the application. And you can do that with help of a component provided by that React Redux package, which we also installed. Now I'll do that here in my app component, because just as with that context provider component earlier in the course, this provider component, which is provided by that third-party library, should be wrapped around all components that need to change the data in the Redux store or that want to read the data. So here I want to wrap the header and then the entire shop and all its nested components. So therefore here in the app component, we should import the provider component, that's its name, from the React Redux package, and then use that to wrap this component tree here, like this. Now the provider component needs a store prop, and you might already be able to guess what the value for that prop should be. It should, of course, be our store here, which we're exporting in the store.ts file. Therefore, in the app component, this store must be imported from this store folder and there the store.ts file, and should then be used as a value for store. And with that, the Redux store is being made available. Now the question is how we can interact with it, how we can, for example, dispatch actions that trigger these reducers. Now, dispatching actions that trigger reducers is pretty straightforward when using Redux Toolkit. You don't have to create custom action types as we did it earlier in the course with the useReducer function. Instead, Redux Toolkit creates those action types and action objects for you. All you have to do to access them is use this card slice here and then this actions property. And that will then give you an object which you can destructure, where you got one function for every reducer, and it has the same name as your reducer methods. But these functions here will actually not directly invoke these functions. Instead, they will create action objects which can then be sent to Redux so that Redux then invokes these reducers for you. But you don't really have to care about that. You just need to use these functions when you dispatch actions. Now, we won't dispatch actions from inside this file, so therefore here I'll export these actions. Now, with that being exported, we can try using these functions, and I'll start with the add to cart function in the product component. Because there we have this add to cart button, and the goal now is to dispatch this add to cart action whenever this button is clicked. For that, we already have the handle add to cart function here, which is connected to this button, and therefore it's now in here where this action should be dispatched. Now, for dispatching actions, we can use a special hook that's provided by React Redux. And that would be the useDispatch hook. You can execute this hook in your component function to get a dispatch function which you can call to dispatch actions. So it's then this dispatch function that should be called in handle add to cart to dispatch an action. And here you now need an action object. Now I could create one on my own, but here TypeScript is actually just expecting a type property. Instead of creating that on my own, it's better to use this add to cart function, which is exported here by the card slice file. So I'm importing this here now in my product TSX file. And it's now this add to cart function that should be executed here. And this will then generate an action. Now, this function here is based on this reducer. And since here we have a payload action that needs some data, I'm also forced to pass that data here. So we must pass an object to add to cart, and then here add all the data that's required. That starts with an ID, which I at the moment don't have in this component, but getting it is simple because it's actually part of the props. So we just have to destructure it here. And then, besides the ID, we should also forward the title and the price. And that will do the trick. Now, it's actually recommended to not use the useDispatch hook like this though, but to instead create your own version of that hook for extra type safety. For that, it's common to add a hooks.ts file next to your store-related files. And in here, you can and should then import from React Redux this useDispatch hook. In addition, before continuing here, you should go to the store.ts file where the main store is configured and create a new custom type here, which should get exported. And you can name this type app.dispatch, though the name of course is up to you. This type should in the end describe how dispatching will work or which kind of data will be involved with dispatching in your application. You can get that information by accessing this store and then there the dispatch property. However, that's now a value, not a type. Therefore, you must use TypeScript's typeof operator here to get the type of that property. Now that can be confusing. To show you what I mean, I'll add another constant here, which stores a string. And now let's say I want to create a type that catches the type of this constant. So the type could be called n or anything like that. I can't set it equal to name because name is a value, not a type. However, I can use the typeof operator, which does not just exist in JavaScript, but which is also supported by TypeScript, to get the type of that value and then store that type in my alias here. So that n would now be of type max actually, since it's a constant, or if I change it to be a variable, it would be of type string. So that's what typeof does here when used in conjunction with creating a custom type, for example. And here, this will simply give us a type that has more information regarding which kind of actions can be dispatched here, you could say. Back in the hooks.ts file, this type should then be used to create a custom hook, a custom useCartDispatch hook, for example, though this name is up to you. But it should have a type, which you then also should create here, which can be named dispatch function. And that should be a function type that yields this app.dispatch type, which we just created and exported in store.ts. And this is now the type this constant should have, and the value should then be the standard useDispatch hook. So not executing it here, instead we just point at it. So it's still the original hook without any changes, but with extra type information, you could say. And whilst this might be confusing and might be strange, this is a general setup step you simply can go through every time you set up Redux in a React app with TypeScript. Simply create your own better typed version of the standard useDispatch hook. With that done, this should be exported. And now back in product.tsx, it's now this custom hook that should be called here. So here we should now call useCartDispatch like this. And that now needs to be imported from that hooks.ts file we just worked on. And this import here of the standard useDispatch hook can now be removed. But with that, most importantly, this action should be created and should be dispatched. Now in the most type-safe way possible. But of course, in order to see whether that worked, we now also need to add code to listen to state changes and to update the UI whenever some state changes. Now to listen to state changes, I want to start in the header component. Because there I have this number of items that's in the cart that's shown next to this cart text on this cart button. And that of course should change whenever the items in the cart change. Therefore, we need to get access to that cart data that's managed by Redux. And we can get that access with another hook that's provided by React Redux, though just as with the useDispatch hook, you should also create your own version of that hook. That's recommended by the official docs, so that's what we'll do here. The hook we need is the useSelector hook. And we should now create and export our own useCardSelector hook, or however you want to call it. Now, to create that, we need to import something else from React Redux, and that something else will be a type. It will be the typed useSelector hook. And we need that to then get better TypeScript support once we start selecting data from the store, so that we get good auto-completion and TypeScript fully understand what's in our store when we start selecting data with help of useSelector. That's why we need this type to improve useSelector and fine-tune it for our specific store and our specific data here. So our custom hook here should again be the standard useSelector hook, so we don't change its logic, but we change its type. We make it more specific and, as mentioned, fine-tune it for our application. And we do that by setting it equal to this typed useSelector hook we just imported. That, however, is a generic type, and the related type it needs is a type that describes the data in our store. Now we can get that information from inside the store TS file. Because here's our store, here's where we can get information about the data managed in that store. So therefore here we should export another custom type, which could be called root state. And this custom type again needs to be created by getting the type of some value that's in our store here. So we again access some property here, but here it's the getState property. The problem, however, is that getState is not a standard property, but instead a method. Therefore, rootState now is a function type. We are actually interested in the return value of that function though, not in the overall function. And thankfully, TypeScript has a utility type which we can use to get hold of the return value of a function. So that when we have a function type, as it's the case here, we can extract a part of that function type and store that in a new type. And here it's the return value of the function type which we want to store in a new type. The utility type I'm talking of is the return type, which, as mentioned, is built into TypeScript. So it's not part of the browser, not part of React, it's part of TypeScript. It's a generic type, and the related type you should pass to it is the function type from which you want to get the return value. So this might look confusing, but it's hopefully clear what the idea is. We simply get the shape of the state managed by our store by accessing the getState method, which would give us the store data. And then we get the type of that, which gives us a function value type. And we then just get the return type of that function type to get the shape of the data that would be yielded by getState. And it's now that root state that we use here in hooks.ts. Here we should import root state side by side with app.dispatch and pass that root state as a generic type argument to the typed useSelector hook type, like this. And that then simply creates a more type-aware version of the default useSelector hook. A version that is specifically aware of the data that we are managing in our store. And that's of course what we need here. So now here, with the custom selector hook added, we can finally go to the place where we want to select data. So in this case, the header component. And then in there, call this useCardSelector hook we just worked on. We have to import it, and then we can call it, and then this hook wants a function. This function will automatically receive the latest state snapshot. Redux will take care of that. And we then just have to define which part of that overall data that's being managed we want to extract. We could extract the entire state snapshot, but we can also just extract a part of it if we want to. And here I actually want to extract my cart slice data, and then there the items, though for this header component, I don't need the entire items array. Instead, I just need a value I can use down there, which in the end should be the summed up quantity of all items in that items array. And we can easily sum that up by using the built-in reduce method, which is not related to Redux or the useReducer hook, but which is instead built into the browser and which can be used to combine multiple items in an array to a single value. For that, reduce needs a function as a first argument and a starting value, in this case 0, as a second argument. This function will then receive the current value and the current item for which it's being executed, because it will be executed for all items in this array. And this value will be that starting value here, if it's the first time this function is being executed. Otherwise, it will be the last value returned by that function, because this function here now must return an updated value. And that's simply the old value here plus the item quantity. And therefore then this code will sum up all the item quantities, and therefore then this useCartSelector hook will give me the result of this calculation, and we can store this in a constant, which could be called cart quantity. And it's now this cart quantity that should be output here on this button. Well, and with that, hopefully everything should work now. We should be able to dispatch an action from inside the product component, and we should be able to update the UI based on changing state in the Redux store here in the header component. So if we go back and reload this app, you can watch this number here as I click add to cart, and as you can see, it goes up. Now what we don't see are the cart items in the cart when I open it. But that's what we'll work on next. And as always, this is of course also something you can practice doing on your own. Otherwise, we'll do it together in the next lectures. So let's now finish this app by making sure that when we open the cart, we also show the cart items here. Now, for that, we need to go to the cart items TSX file, because that's the place where those cart items should be output. And indeed, there already is some code in here, which at the moment just is commented out and needs to be tweaked a little bit, needs to be edited a little bit. Most importantly, in here, we should start by also calling useCartSelector to get our cart items. As mentioned in the last lecture, here we have to pass a function to useCartSelector, and will automatically get the latest state snapshot, and then we can access the cart slice and then there the items. And that then gives us the cart items. With those cart items being fetched here, we can comment in this code, get rid of these comments here, like this, and we map through the cart items here. This code is already there and should work just fine. I'm also outputting the price here, the title, the ID, and then here, for these buttons, I'm trying to call functions that don't exist. And I'm passing some data to these functions, as you see. The ID of the item that should be removed or reduced in the cart, and the entire item that should be added or increased. Down here, we also have a formatted total price, which we need to add. And I'll actually start with that, because that's relatively straightforward. We can simply create a new formatted total price constant, And the value then should be the total price of all cart items formatted such that we only have 2 decimal places. So for that, I'll first of all get my total price by going through all the cart items with help of the reduce method, which we saw in action in the last lecture as well. This time I'm not trying to get the total quantity, but the total price. The general idea is the same though. We have a starting value of 0, and then we get the current value and the item in this function, and the return value is the current value plus item.price times item.quantity. And then we can use this total price here to call toFixed to on it, to limit it to 2 decimal places. I also want to add a $sign in front of it, so therefore down here I'll also add such a $sign. And with that, we should be creating and outputting that formatted total price. Of course, now we need the handle remove from cart and the handle add to cart functions here to get rid of these errors. So therefore, I'll start with handle add to cart, and I'll add such a function here as a nested function in this cart items component, as we have done it many times before in this course. This will then receive an item as an argument, as a parameter, and that item will be a cart item, as you can see down there. Therefore, the type should be cart item. And that's a type which I defined before in the cart slice TS file. There I have such a cart item type, and therefore all we have to do is export it by adding the export keyword in front of it. And then back in cart items, we can easily import it. Like this from cartslice.ts. So that's the handle add to cart function. In this function, we of course want to dispatch an action. Therefore, we need this useCartDispatch hook, which is also imported from this hooks file. And we need the action that should be dispatched. We can import those actions from the cart slice TS file, of course, because that's where we're exporting them. I'm talking about these action creator functions, to be precise. So here we need to import the add to cart and the remove from cart action creators, because we'll need both. And cart item is a type, by the way, so we can add this annotation to optimize our imports. Now with all those imports added, and with useCartDispatch being called here, we'll get back a dispatch function from that hook, and we can now use this function here in the handle add to cart function. And the action object that should be dispatched will be created by this add to cart action creator function here. We just execute it, and then this in the end wants an object with an ID, title, and price, so in the end we can pass our item here, because this cart item has all that information. It actually also has a property which is not needed by add to cart, but TypeScript has no problem with that here. Therefore, we can now also add this other missing function, the handle remove from cart function, like this. And here we just get the item ID, which is of type string. So therefore here we should accept such an ID. And then dispatch another action where we use the remove from cart action creator function. And that function wants one argument, which should be of type string. Therefore, it's simply that ID that's passed to remove from cart. And that should, in general, be all. However, I still want to fine-tune the JSX code here and, for example, only output this message here if we really have no items in the cart. So here we can check if cart items length is equal to 0, and if that's the case, this paragraph will be output. Similarly, down here, we want to check if cart items length is greater than 0, like this, and only output this unordered list if that's the case. The closing curly brace goes here. So therefore, with that, we can now save this, go back, reload, and add some items to the cart, and then also open the cart, and we can see those items here. And we can now also edit those items from inside the cart, remove them, increase them in quantity, and do all these things. And therefore, with that, we did now successfully also build an application that uses Redux. And, of course, TypeScript, because that's the main topic of this course. TypeScript with React. But as you can tell, there wasn't too much TypeScript-specific work that had to be done. Most importantly, we had to set up these special types and hooks to get the best possible TypeScript support when selecting data and dispatching actions, but that was almost all. Sure, we also set up our state type here, and we used this special payload action type here to get better TypeScript support with that action. But other than that, we really just used Redux as you would use it in any React project. Now, throughout this course, you learned a lot about using React with TypeScript. But of course, only practice makes perfect, and that's why this section here exists. Because this is a practice section that gives you an opportunity to apply the knowledge you gain throughout this course. And for that, you should build this demo application, which you're seeing here, which allows users to browse dummy coaching sessions and sign up for those sessions, book those sessions, and which also allows users to then view and cancel those sessions. And whilst this, of course, still is a fairly basic dummy demo app, it is an app that will allow you to apply the knowledge you gained throughout this course. Now, for this section, I prepared a starting project, which you find attached to this lecture, of course, also a code sandbox version. And then in the next lecture, you'll find a bit more details about this project you should build and which core features should be included. In the lecture thereafter, you'll then also find some hints that should help you if you're getting stuck. And I, of course, did not just prepare a starting project, but instead, I also prepared a demo solution, which you, of course, also find attached not to this lecture, but instead to the last lecture of this section. And in my example solution code base, you'll find all the code I wrote and also some helpful comments that should help you understand the more tricky or difficult parts of that code. And therefore, this section really is intended to give you an opportunity to practice what you learned without my help. Though, as mentioned, I of course do give you that example solution as well, so that you can compare your solution to mine.